Hi, Fadi.
Hi, Bob.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of The Wright Show on Blogging Heads TV. You are Fadi Quran. You are a Palestinian activist. Over the last few years, you've been a nonviolent Palestinian activist. In particular, you were one of the leaders of the Freedom Rider movement, which was modeled after the Freedom Rider thing in the American Civil Rights Movement. In this case, it was designed to protest segregated buses, I guess, or buses maybe that are only available to Israeli Jews on the West Bank. The Palestinians aren't even allowed to ride on, I guess. Is that right? Is it that the buses were segregated or the Palestinians weren't allowed to ride on the buses at all?
Palestinians from the West Bank were allowed to ride on the buses.
They were allowed to ride?
No, they weren't.
They were not at all.
Yeah.
Okay. They were buses for Jews only.
Yeah, because
And
they went through settlements and there are the segregated roads of the settlements and so forth.
right, there's a whole system of roads that are only accessible in the West Bank that are only accessible to the settlers. So, I thought it'd be interesting to talk to you, given that we are now in a period of what some people would call violent Palestinian activism. I think everyone's heard that there have been, a number of stabbings of Israeli Jews in a what seems to be a not centrally coordinated movement, but nonetheless, people think it could turn into a third kind of intifada or uprising. Now, what we're hearing is that this is about the question of access to Al-Aqsa Mosque, which, as people who've been there know, there's a single kind of space that is sacred to both Jews and Muslims. On top is Al-Aqsa Mosque. Jews worship at the western wall of the ancient temple, which apparently was once underneath where the mosque is now. But any event, it's contested space. And what we're hearing is that the big issue is who has access under what circumstances to the space. But from your point of view, is that what is driving this?
No, that's not the only thing that's driving this. I think that played a role to accelerate the escalation. But one thing that the media isn't focusing on, and I think the most important thing and the most hopeful thing of what's happening now, is that all of throughout historical Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, Israel, there have been hundreds of protests from small communities being led by a new generation of Palestinians, and their key demands have revolved around just wanting a better future. And I think the issue of what happened in the Aqsa Mosque and the holy sanctuary around it was kind of the hair that broke the camel's back, in the sense that in Jerusalem particularly, and this is where the kind of protests and the different violent actions happened initially, Israel has instituted a policy and a plan that seeks to ensure that 70% of the population in Jerusalem is not Palestinian, is Israeli. And so over 40% of the houses in Jerusalem are under demolition orders. They could be demolished by Israel at any time. If you're a Palestinian Jerusalemite and you decide to go abroad and live abroad for a few years, then Israel will take away your ID and you'll never be allowed to return back home. And I think those policies and their intensity in Jerusalem, but also their presence throughout the West Bank in the certain spat of settler violence, the extremist right-wing Israelis attacking Palestinian communities, particularly the burning of a whole family, a mother and a father and their 9-month-year-old child a few months ago, kind of slowly led to the rising in these protests. Now, the media has really kind of grasped onto the violent actions, the stabbings that have happened. But in reality, there's something much larger happening on the ground in Palestine that has to do with the Palestinian people, and particularly the new generation. Most of these people taking action, whether protesting or other actions, are people between the ages of 18 and 30. And the actions that they're taking and the reasons that they're taking these actions are largely because they feel like they've been let down by their own leadership. They've been oppressed by the kind of military occupation and also by the international community. And that's the real context, is that there's a real deep darkness right now in Palestine due to these oppressive policies of military occupation. And literally people are searching or trying to rise, the vast majority of them in different ways throughout the West Bank, a few through these stabbing attacks, young men. But the real motive is that people are searching for freedom. There's been a generation that's grown up under so much despair and that's grown up without any type of freedom. They're now trying to fight for it and get it by any means necessary.
Okay, before we explore that further, you mentioned Jerusalem. We maybe should provide just a little bit of background, which is, there's West Jerusalem, which Israel occupied even before the 1967 war, and then there's East Jerusalem, which it occupied only after that war, and which is remains largely Arab, although there's, as you said, there more and more Arabs have been displaced by Jewish enclaves. Under international law, East Jerusalem is not considered part of Israel. Israel considers East Jerusalem part of Israel because it did some kind of whether it was technically annexation or not, I'm not sure, but it did some kind of unilateral maneuver that is contested by the international community and not recognized by the United Nations. And of course, East Jerusalem is generally thought that in any two-state solution, East Jerusalem would belong to the Palestinians. And the old city, which is right there, was also not under Israeli control before 1967, and that's where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is. So just by way of background, there's that. Now on to the this issue of So you're saying you, for some time now, have been feeling more kind of energy within this younger demographic, some of which is certainly now violent, but not all of which is violent. I mean, what different kinds of things have people been doing to try to change the situation? Have Palestinians been doing?
I mean, there's been kind of a focus on four different paths. So there's been a group of Palestinians, particularly civil society, has focused on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. In essence, this idea that is, asking people around the world to stop supporting the Israeli occupation, to stop supporting the Israeli military, to divest from companies that are profiting from human rights abuses. And that's proven actually is growing in its effectiveness. And then there's been the different activists on the ground, whether in certain villages, for years now, there have been the weekly protests, but also more recently, in almost every Palestinian community right now, particularly the rural communities, young men and women have established what you would call kind of safety networks and volunteers who just watch out for settler attacks, because there's been a huge spike in attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinian farmland and on Palestinian homes. So these group of young men and women kind of stay up late, they watch the neighborhood, they warn people if any attacks are coming, and they also oftentimes do joint efforts to harvest crops. Right now, particularly, there's the olive harvest, and that's when a lot of the attacks happen. And currently, there are thousands of volunteer groups going down together to harvest with farmers, because more numbers will ensure that these people are not attacked by settlers. A lot of them organize protests in their villages. There's been, there's a growing movement, and I would say a hopeful movement, but a movement that's also rising through kind of a very, very dark situation. And those actions haven't, unfortunately, gotten the media attention that violence gets. I think, blood is always more interesting for kind of media outlets. But this is I think this is where the real juice is, and this is where the future of Palestine is really being built, in the future of liberation. And so, that's kind of the context in the terms of the civil disobedience action. And then there's the third level, which is kind of supporting international accountability, pushing the Palestinian Authority and pushing international institutions like the International Criminal Court and so forth to hold Israel accountable, increased recognition of Palestine. And the fourth and final thing is there's also been an effort here in Palestine to establish I would say a kind of new economy, because the Palestinian economy is completely controlled by the occupation. We're besieged by the occupation, but there have been new efforts to create co-ops, to create different kind of, I would say, economic tools, startups, innovative companies that can break away from this control. And all of this has been happening to a large extent by, again, a new generation of Palestinians that are seeking freedom. But I also, we need to know that the amount of pressure and the amount of darkness, it's similar to what Dr. King kind of replied to people who were asking him about riots and why African Americans decided to riot. And he quoted Victor Hugo, and I'm not going to use the exact quote, but he said that, when there is immense darkness, one will find sin will happen, and the responsibility is on those who create the darkness, not those who sin. And I think, with all that's happening to kind of pursue liberty, with all these hopeful actions, there has actually been just an increased amount of violence towards Palestinians and structural violence. And I think that's what has led, like many of the young men who have decided to go and conduct these violent acts, it's not coming from an empty space, and it's not coming from religious zeal. It's coming because a lot of them are really living in very dark places, and if you just look at what they've faced, you'll see that something very horrible happened to them that led them to do what they did. And I think to achieve peace, it's getting rid of that structure of violence. To achieve freedom, it's getting rid of that structure of violence that's really needed, and that's what the occupation creates.
Okay, there's a lot there. Let me ask you, first of all, can you imagine a scenario whereby in the near term something productive comes from the violent part of the uprising right now? The stabbings and so on. Can you imagine that that might lead to some kind of breakthrough, in negotiations or anything like that? Or do you think at this point we're in for a long haul? And I guess I'm also asking, is there a lot of momentum behind this violent part of the movement? I mean, do you expect that if there is no breakthrough, the violence is going to continue for a long time?
I mean, it all depends on kind of how the context on the ground develops. So I think we need to kind of look at three scenarios. There's one scenario in which the Israeli response to this violence, and this is kind of the scenario that we're seeing on the ground right now, and the Israeli escalation of already existing Israeli violent tactics, such as the arrests. So even before this kind of wave of violence, Israel increased the amounts of arrests of Palestinians from approximately 12 per day to about 60 per day. And this is before all that's been happening in the last few weeks. And I think if Israel keeps escalating the violence, and particularly if the settlers keep escalating the violence, then you are going to enter into a vicious circle in which the violence keeps increasing, and also where the other types of actions on the ground continue to increase. Because again, this violence isn't coming from a vacuum. It's coming as a response to immense Israeli violence. It's coming where young men feel that this is their hero's journey. They feel that if they're living in a neighborhood where their house is going to be demolished, where they can't marry the person they love, where some of them can't go to their grandparents' funeral, And
Because you mean because of the restrictions on their movement?
yeah, because it's the restrictions are so severe that literally you have people who can't like I know at least two stories of a young woman and a young man who were living or are living apart now from their grandparents, and their grandparents passed away, and because of the restrictions they couldn't go to their funerals. And just
where did the grandparents live, and where did they live?
Their grandparents lived in the West Bank, and they lived in Jerusalem,
In East Jerusalem?
in East Jerusalem. And
Uh-huh.
there are, restrictions. Like I live about 7 miles away, and I can't get to East Jerusalem. Now the where the kind of, because there's a lot in the media about the mosque and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's that's been a symbol where, for the vast majority of Palestinians, particularly in Jerusalem, in the end, that was for a lot of people the way that they connected spiritually. Oftentimes when you go and pray, a lot of the difficult things you face become, less heavy. And suddenly,
Mm-hmm.
through kind of different Israeli policies, through Israeli efforts to change the status quo on the mosque, a lot of people who literally that was their last kind of sanctuary felt that that was under threat. And like I said, that was the hair that broke the camel's back for
Yeah.
many of
I mean,
these young
we
men.
should say that we need to get into the weeds here, but we should say that Israel denies that there's been any fundamental change of status and access to the mosque, and that the reports of this have been hugely exaggerated in an irresponsible fashion by people, and that's fanning the flames of violence. That, at any rate, is the Israeli side of the story.
I mean,
But
I think it's interesting because, again, we don't want to get into the weeds, but I would tell like the average person who wants an objective kind of look at this, to look at even the Israeli police data and the report by the International Crisis Group about how the policies have changed. And even if you look at just the police data and the different restrictions that Israel has imposed on the mosque in the last year, the data itself says about how they've decreased the amount of Palestinians that can access and so forth. So, there's really hard numbers about how Israel, and particularly the extremists. So I think an important note here is that there is a fringe in Israel that believes that, the mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, should be destroyed and the temple should be established there. And that was for many years kind of a fringe in Israeli society. But in the last elections, the leaders of these views, or the believers of these views, became ministers and Knesset members, and it's been slowly growing in Israel. And they've also played a role in escalating it. But so to go back to, I think, your question about where is this going. So there is that scenario where you do enter this kind of increased cyclone of violence, and it just keeps getting worse. But there are also efforts happening right now, to quiet things down and to kind of return things to the status quo, which is, for Palestinians, the status quo is horrible because it just means continued lack of freedom and continued restrictions. But for the Israelis, it means a certain level of stability, particularly for the Israeli government. And Kerry and the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and Netanyahu are kind of working on that. And so yesterday it was said that there was an agreement between Kerry and Netanyahu on shifting some Israeli policies to allow that stability to return. And then the third scenario, I think, is that this is the scenario I think is more likely, because you have a new generation of Palestinians, and because there's just, in the end, people want freedom and people want to feel that they're living in dignity. So even if this current kind of escalation dies down, I think in the next years, you're just going to see more and more escalations, more and more Palestinian uprisings that are going to take many forms. And I think many forms that are going to be inspiring to the global community, until at the end, the cost of the occupation is going to be too high, and Israel's going to have to end it and give Palestinians their freedom. But those are the kind of three scenarios, and I can't tell you which one is going to play out because we'll have to see how the regional context develops around that.
Mm-hmm. The and when you talk about a movement that could inspire the global community, I assume you're talking about nonviolent things, ranging from protest, civil disobedience to the boycott, divestment movement that you referred to. I gather, and if I'm right about that, is the violence kind of a problem for does that really complicate that path to progress from your point of view?
I mean, that's a very good question, and I think it's also important to know that usually kind of the Palestinians are largely ignored until violent action begins to happen. And I think that there are certain forms of violence, particularly those that target innocent civilians, that are completely unacceptable. But I think that there are, and in every struggle, whether it was in India or the civil rights movement, kind of the Martin Luther King / Malcolm X example, or in South Africa, where the ANC pursued certain acceptable civil disobedience actions that were non-violent and certain that were violent. I think in Palestine, in the end, because again of the context that people live in, different people are going to see different ways to challenge the status quo. And there's some kind of forms of disrupting the status quo that can be viewed as violent from abroad, like taking down the wall, the Israeli separation wall, the apartheid wall. That can, a lot of people will try to frame as violent. Certainly, the Israeli government and Netanyahu will try to frame as violent, but that are in the end part of a larger struggle to freedom. And that's what I mean when I say that there's a growing movement. It's that I think in the end you will see both acts of non-violence and acts of violence, but acts that are, I would say, ethically and morally acceptable for the people around the world. And I think it's going to be again something very similar to what we saw in South Africa, where there was a mix of the both, but people understood that those things are being used and those tactics are being used for a broader cause, which is that there are people who really want to live with dignity and who really want freedom, and they're like a rising phoenix in essence, using whatever they can to just fly through the ashes and build something new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, my reading of this situation, not that I'm an expert, is that the number of people who are going to be sympathetic to the violent part of the activism is internationally, I mean, outside of Israel, Palestine, is going to be a pretty small fraction of the number, the overall number who might be sympathetic to the movement if it's confined to non-violent activities, right? I mean, isn't it your experience in talking to people abroad that's far and away their preference? I mean, I assume it's the case that you've discovered that it's actually very hard to get the attention of people outside of that area with nonviolent activities. But haven't you found that most people who might otherwise be sympathetic to the cause don't like the idea of people who are walking along the street in Israel being stabbed?
Yeah, and so that's not what I was kind of referring to in those, in my comments. I was referring to actions such as, people taking their hammers to the wall and kind of tearing down the wall like we saw in Berlin, mm-hmm. or, people marching through checkpoints and taking the checkpoints apart. But I do think that there is, kind of just speaking from an outside objective view, there is a certain level of hypocrisy, I think, in how the international community treats Palestinian resistance in all its forms, where, when you see a rising amount of nonviolent action, when you see people doing things that completely fall in line. I'm a student of Dr. Kings and Gandhis, you know. But when people do things that are in line with that, the international community is usually like meh. And it's true that, you know, for that to be really effective, it still needs to grow in a larger movement. But the moment that something violent happens, suddenly there's just more attention on the conflict. And there's, you know, sometimes attention, regardless of how it looks, is key in helping shifting the status quo. So I'll give you, a small example would be in Jerusalem. So there have been for the last kind of years people establishing different libraries and community centers in Jerusalem as acts of like nonviolent disobedience. And their houses have been, destroyed. Their community centers have been destroyed, and nobody did anything. And even in the old city, but and again, of course, kind of attacking innocent civilians is wrong, but the moment you've had this kind of escalation, suddenly Kerry gets involved and demands that the Israelis push back their different, kind of activities around the holy sanctuary in the old city, and demands that the Israelis decrease the level of oppressive policies that they're implementing towards Jerusalemites as a way to calm things down. So, there is that kind of question where it's understandable that people want to see the nonviolent action, and that a lot of people will say, and again, the type of action that we do, that I do, that I care about, people will say this is what's needed to end the situation and oppression in Palestine. But when you look at de facto policy on the ground, it's usually only violent action that gains some type of response. People in Jerusalem will tell you that, after what happened, they actually feel that for in terms of settler attacks against them, things have gotten a bit better, because they're not having settlers going into their communities and torching their homes and so forth. So again, there is this kind of interesting dynamic that I think is worth really delving into.
Yeah. My friend Daniel Levy, you may know, who's an Israeli, you may know of his writing, says that the problem is that when there's not violence, when there's not a perceived threat to Israel, then Israelis don't think that the Palestinian problem has a high enough priority to address. And when there is violence, they feel too threatened to talk seriously about like a two-state solution or something. And he says that's kind of the problem. But let me ask you about, it's certainly the case that, this gets more attention when there's violence than when there isn't violence, for better or worse. Let me ask you about a separate issue, which is how clear and unified are the objectives of the Palestinians? You said that, first of all, younger Palestinians, by and large, don't identify with Abbas, the ostensible leader of the Palestinians, so he can't necessarily speak for them. And I know that with the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement you mentioned, one thing you hear from Israelis in response to that is that BDS, as it's called, is associated with a goal that they find extreme, which is the so-called one-state solution. Well, there's different versions of the one-state solution, but this is one in which I guess Palestinians would have an unrestricted right of return to Israel proper, which includes places from which Palestinians had been displaced as long ago as 60, 70 years ago. And they say, look, if there's a completely unrestricted right of Palestinians to migrate to Israel proper, then in effect the entire place will become a Palestinian state. Israelis may be forced to leave, but certainly at a minimum it would no longer be a Jewish state. So, in other words, what they're saying is, look, with BDS, we're not talking about just the minimal version of the two-state solution you may hear about, where two states, after land swaps, live in peace. They're saying that there's a much more extreme, from their point of view, objective. And so I guess it's a long-winded way of setting up a question, but I guess my question is, are they right that that's the consensus objective, or is there no consensus among Palestinians on what the long-term goal is?
I think in Palestine, there is a really strong consensus on what people want in 20 years. And, part of my work, I work for an organization called Avaz right now. I'm a senior campaigner there. And we have about 60,000 subscribers in Palestine. And we do different campaigning, but I'm in touch with the vast majority of the young movement here on the ground in Palestine, throughout all of historical Palestine, including Gaza, and also with Palestinians that are in the diaspora, like in refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan and so forth. And one of the key things that I've been trying to develop in speaking with all these people, and one of the key way, it's very good to have access to so many people, because you can do polling and actually see where people stand on many of these issues and what people want in the future. On a very basic level, what I found, and it's something we actually spoke about a little bit the last time we had a discussion on Blogging Heads. But if you ask the average Palestinian, what do you want in 20 years at a very basic level, they'll tell you that they want a sense of freedom, in the sense that there's no occupation and so forth. They want to feel that there's at least present justice. They want to feel equal. They want to feel like they have everything that they've lost, whether it's land or so forth, that they have at least a part of that back that allows them to live a life where they can pursue equal opportunity, and that they want to live in dignity. And one of the questions that I've polled, and when I go and meet with the different members of the activists on the ground, and even with the youth leaders of the different political parties here, people tell you that in 20 years we want to have freedom, justice, and dignity. And any solution, whether it's the one-state solution, two-state solution, 50-state solution, as long as the political solution provides that to us, to our families, and to our communities, that's what we are fighting for at the end of the day. Now, and there's a lot of unity, particularly among the younger Palestinian generation. The older generation is much more, I would say, politicized and phased about getting into the, one state, two state, that type of whole debate. Now, the question of, and I think before I go to what you mentioned about the BDS and the lack of unity, I think that's very important for just people around the world to kind of understand, because that's where the Palestinian journey is. It's pursuing freedom and pursuing justice in the long term, and any type of solution that gives them that, we will be happy with as a people. And that's what we're fighting for. That's the key thing we're fighting for. Now, one of the key things that the Palestinians on the ground right now protesting are saying is that we don't agree with our political leadership because they're so divided, whether you're Hamas or Fatah or the different leftist parties. The vast majority of the youth on the ground right now, and you see it in every protest, particularly in Palestinian and Arabic media, they say we don't want these guys and we don't believe in any of the solutions that these guys are presenting, whether it's the type of two-state solution that's being presented by Mahmoud Abbas or the type of solution that's being presented by Hamas, an Islamic State or so forth. People have lost faith in that and have lost faith in these parties because they haven't been able to unify around any type of demands. And that's where the disunity is when people talk about disunity in kind of Palestinian perspectives. Now, the BDS, I think, has, from my knowledge of it, and I know the leaders of the movement quite well, they don't take a position on the one-state or two-state solution at all. They say that we have three demands: that the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza comes to an end. The second demand of the BDS movement is that Palestinians living within Israel right now have equal rights. So, they're calling for equal rights for all within that territory. And then they call for the right of return. And they say, from the BDS's perspective, and they've done this, very kind of in a calculated way, because there's also kind of disagreements within Palestine on the broader, again, political solution. And so they state very clearly that if you can provide those three things, those and of course, this is the emphasis of the BDS movement, under the context of international law. So, ending the occupation, giving equal rights, and the right of return as defined under international law. Those are the key demands of that movement. And so I think, again, there's kind of disunity in the type of political solution that people put forward, but there isn't disunity in what the Palestinian people want in the long term. And I think this is a constant kind of debate of putting the wheel before the horse, type of thing, where if we want to seek those things, freedom, justice, and dignity, we need to shift the power balance through different actions here to then, when we sit across the table from the Israelis, be able to say, listen, this is what we want. We want it for all people here. And we're powerful enough to achieve that, not to enter into type of peace talks to discuss solutions that with the current power balance won't be possible. And I think, and I will end with this, going back to the question before that about violence, there's always this talk about in Palestine and Israel, there's this uptick of violence, these stabbings happen, and so there's more violence. I think it's important, and it's deeply the truth, deeply factual, to know that Palestinians on a daily basis suffer from Israeli violence, suffer from structural violence. And there's no such thing as a calm status quo or stability. Usually what that means is that, Israel's living calmly and happy, and the Palestinians are still under the boot, and they're still having their children being arrested, and they're still not getting water, and they're still being attacked by settlers. So there hasn't been for Palestinians any phase in which they haven't faced Israeli violence. It's constantly there.
Okay, so on the three things that you said, Palestinians are united in wanting, I think it's the final of those, the right of return, that Israelis think actually kind of implies a one-state solution. The right of return is the idea that anyone with any kind of claim to land, I gather, right of return means that anyone who had land before whatever it is, 1947, in Palestine, or maybe at any point has been displaced from land, and their descendants, their ancestors, their children, their grandchildren, would have the right to return to Israel proper. And of course, these people right now are not only in the West Bank, but in refugee camps in various Arab countries. So I think Israelis imagine this influx, and they're so frightened of this that in the latest, in the negotiations over two-state solution that ended in failure a year or two ago, or three maybe now, the Israelis wouldn't even put this on the table. They wouldn't even contemplate a kind of nominal acknowledgement of right of return that was designed to wind up with a token number of Palestinians returning to Israel, which is one scenario you hear, right? Is that, okay, we'll say there's a right of return, but in many cases we'll just provide financial compensation instead, and so on, so there will be too many people coming back. But the Israelis weren't willing to talk, and this was across the board. This wasn't just Likud. It was pretty much a consensus that they're not even going to talk about that because it seems to terrify them. So there's that, and I guess that's related to the actual question I'm going to ask you, which is you said that Palestinians reject both Abbas when he talks about the two-state solution and Hamas when they talk about more extreme solutions. Are you saying that they reject the two-state solution per se, or just that basically anything Abbas says they're not going to listen to because it's Abbas and he's shown himself to be ineffectual?
So it's a mixture of both. This year, in a poll that was run by, the official polling agency here, that are independent of the government, but the most well-known, Chicago, and they found that 52% of Palestinians were against the two-state solution. And then in another poll, 69% of Palestinians said that they don't believe that a two-state solution is possible anymore. So there's number one, the sense of frustration, which is that with all the settlements that Israel has built, and with all the different policies that have been imposed, the two-state solution is just never going to become a reality. We need to, just give that up. And then there's also kind of the political standpoint, which is the two-state solution won't give us the full rights that we've been seeking. And I think there's also the third point, which is that the peace process, which many people believed would be the precursor to a two-state solution, and Abbas's leadership and the leadership of others before him has been so horrendous that people have lost hope in the ability of those who hold on to this view, to the two-state solution as a solution, have lost hope in their ability to achieve it. So I think, those three things have come together to make people just say, okay, this is not going to happen, and we don't want this to happen if this is what it's going to look like.
Mm-hmm. There are people on the Israeli side, not many of them for sure, who talk about a kind of benign one-state solution. In other words, working out a way that Israel and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and I don't know if they include Gaza, but could be a single national polity in which the rights of all groups would be respected. You might have some kind of confederation arrangement, but in any event, there are Israeli activists who speak in support of that. Is there much explicit discussion of that among Palestinians? In other words, a one-state solution that Jews would not have reason to be so fearful of.
Yeah, I mean, for most Palestinians that espouse a kind of one-state solution, that's what they're talking about, kind of a country in which all people are equal regardless of their religion, in which everyone kind of has their personal, and individual rights protected. That's kind of what's being pursued, at least, again, speaking from the circle of the activists and the people on the ground who are most likely going to be the future leaders. That's exactly what they mean. And for the majority of them, they'll tell you that we are already living in a one-state solution, but it's an apartheid one state, because, they'll tell you that Israel controls everything, including in the West Bank and through the blockade on Gaza. Israel's building settlements all around where we live. So you already have a one-state solution, and it's apartheid. There's segregation. There aren't any equal rights, and we just want to break down the system and create a new one where people have equal rights, where people have freedom, and where all people feel that they have achieved a sense of justice. But that's. I hope that answers your question. But that's what most people are thinking of. Of course, not all people. You have extremists on both sides whose view of a one-state solution is, getting rid of anyone who's different from that state.
Mm-hmm. And I gather there's still virtually no support among Palestinians for doing something like just demanding the right to vote in Israeli elections. I mean, I've always thought, I think we've discussed it, I've always thought, in terms of international perception, that would be a huge winner, because but there are, I gather, reasons that Palestinians aren't comfortable with, the West Bank Palestinians, I'm talking about in particular, aren't comfortable with the idea of asking for participation in the current political system, right?
Yeah.
As it's structured.
Yeah, I mean, one of the there is kind of course, it's like a smart idea in a sense of, particularly the international world. It's so simple, just one man, one vote. We want to be equal in this country. The reason people wouldn't adopt that here and particularly now is number one, people see the Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, and they see how they're treated as second class citizens. So people actually don't trust the Israeli political system in the sense that even if we demand to vote and even if we could vote, people don't trust that it would change anything on the ground because they see that Palestinians living in Jaffa or Haifa or Lud who can vote still are not treated that much better than Palestinians in the West Bank. The second reason is, of course, that the Palestinian cause is kind of a cause for self-determination. So it's a cause for, kind of saying, we want a country in which, we feel that this is our country, our nation. And by asking to vote in Israeli elections, it's kind of saying that we accept to be part of a country that is defined as not our country, because the way Israel defines itself as a Jewish state, you would be saying, well, we accept to be second-class citizens on our own land, but kind of giving credibility and legitimacy to a government that was not made and a country that was not made to represent people like us, which creates a lot of kind of repulsion from that idea.
Right, right. Although, of course, there are enough Palestinians that, and this is certainly true if Gaza were included, but that you might wind up with a majority of Palestinians voting, at which point presumably they could change the laws they don't like. But leaving that aside, the prospect of that implies a second thing, which is that of course Israel would never do this,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
I mean, the point of demanding it would be to get Israel sufficiently focused and concerned that it would change for example, their negotiating stance toward a two-state solution, and they would make more concessions and so on. I think that's what would actually happen, is there would be a new urgency behind the idea of a two-state solution, because internationally, I just think this would be a big momentum builder. But at any event, it seems not to be in the cards. But I gather you do think that, leaving aside the recent spate of violence, there has been a growth in momentum of nonviolent activism. And I take it you're not just talking about BDS. Have you sensed success along other paths as well, nonviolent paths?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think this is where the, real hope lies. But I'll tell you, Bob, everywhere I go throughout Palestine, there are groups of people forming. There's a new movement building here, amassing in Palestine, and they are using tactics that will literally give you goosebumps in terms of their ability to organize their communities, to demand certain rights, to disrupt the Israeli occupation in different ways, whether this is by simply going to land that Israel, so you can imagine a village that's surrounded by a wall. And you can imagine, young men and women coming together, creating a small group, organizing society, and then breaking through that wall to go to their farmlands and actually farming there. And even if a few of them get arrested, even if all of them get arrested, these movements are growing and they're becoming more organized and more connected. And this is, I think, what is going to bring the Israeli occupation down. And this is what's going to bring freedom. Now, the challenge we face, and again, it's important to note, is that because this movement is so threatening to the status quo, it threatens the growth of these young leaders, and the interconnectedness of this movement doesn't only threaten the Israeli occupation, doesn't threaten to disrupt the system of violence and oppression practiced against Palestinians. It also threatens the old Palestinian kind of elite political leaders who also see this as a threat. They don't like the fact that communities are beginning to self-organize and are beginning to connect. And so consequently, that's meant that this movement has been kind of forced to act in a very type of underground way, not very public. not going to the media and putting out statements saying this is what we're doing and so forth, but this is being
I
built
see.
on the ground. And I think that's a very, very beautiful thing. And I think in the next 3 4 5 years, as this movement kind of further coalesces, and as they begin conducting joint actions that inspire the world, uh, things are going to change drastically on the ground here.
Okay, well, you're certainly right that it hasn't gotten much publicity because this is the first I've heard of it. I mean, at least as something that coherent, kind of, and that well developed. But maybe we'll start hearing more about it. I'm wondering if in closing there's anything. I'm wondering two things. If there's anything else you want to add that you haven't said, but also, if you had to predict like where we'll be in 3, 4, 5 weeks, is there anything you'd say? I mean, you expect, in addition to all the nonviolent things you've talked about, you expect the violent manifestations of discontent to continue?
In the next 3 4 5 weeks,
Yeah.
I mean, if things continue to go the way that they're going right now, and again, this is kind of a guess, but they will die down. The certain kind of escalation will die down. You've already kind of begun seeing Israel backing down of certain policies. Today, they've allowed, for the first time in weeks, they've allowed anyone who wanted to go pray in the Old City in Jerusalem, Palestinian Muslims and Christians, they've allowed them to enter. Not all Palestinians, of course, but the Palestinians living in Jerusalem, they've allowed them to enter into the Old City and pray at those sites. That's part of the Kerry Netanyahu deal. You've also seen the kind of Palestinian Authority beginning to take efforts to de-escalate the situation on the ground. Israel has arrested the leaders of many of the protests that have been happening. So largely, I think we will see a de-escalation. But that's only if, again, you don't have an Israeli, Netanyahu could decide, he could come back tomorrow and for political reasons decide to go on a massive, arresting of, let's say, children and activists, or the settlers could do something that is hugely violent, or Jerusalem can be further closed down and more walls could be built. Israel built walls around many neighborhoods in Jerusalem, and if they continue to do so, then that will lead to more escalation. But if I were to guess, again, it depends on those types of decisions and where those in power decide to take this, or where kind of particularly the settlers, the extremist Israeli right, what they decide to do in this upcoming moment. Because they can, put things on fire. The other day, just as an example, so people watching know what I mean. So 2 days ago, settlers in Hebron, the center of Hebron, kind of marched through the old city, chanting "Death to Arabs" and other threats, and marched through some Palestinian neighborhoods. And then two young men, one 15-year-old and one 14-year-old, were killed. So when that happened, the situation was de-escalating, and then suddenly that happened, and you had another flare in what's happening on the ground. So those types of things can keep this alive, and it looks from how the situation is developing now that there are people who have an interest in continuing this. But I think from the broader sense, again, of the kind of growing movement to disrupt the occupation, that is going to continue to grow. That's on an upward slope, and it's going to grow exponentially within the coming year and 2 years until the occupation, collapses.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for taking the time. I know it's late. It's late where you are, and I appreciate you staying up to talk to us. And I hope that maybe as things develop, you'll check in with us down the road and let us know how things are progressing, if at all.
Yeah, and thank you, Bob, for taking the time to interview me. And I would just kind of want to end again with When people look at the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there's often this kind of feel and tension that this issue is too complex and too controversial, that we don't want to get involved, or that if we get involved, we're kind of going to get our fingers burned. And I would just want to tell people watching this that it's not that complex. And if you go in a bit deeper, you'll realize that the controversy is just kind of the top layer. And on the inside, you have this movement for freedom and this kind of urgency to achieve it. And everyone is involved, whether you're living in the US through your tax money or you're living in Europe and there are companies around you that are profiting from the situation on the ground. And the least you can do if you don't want to become part of this movement for freedom is to just ensure that you're not lending yourself to the violence, that you're not lending yourself to the conflict. But I do kind of encourage everyone to get involved and be inspired by this, because this is the anti-apartheid struggle of our time.
Okay, well, thank you again for taking the time, and I imagine we'll be talking to you again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bob. Have a good night.